Great, thank you so much, Rob. I am Kara Cute from Rutgers Cooperative Extension, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Angela Odoms-Young, who is an associate professor and director of the Food and Nutrition Education and Communities Program and the New York State Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program. In 2021, she joined the Cornell faculty after spending 13 years at University of Illinois at Chicago in the Department of Kinesiology and Nutrition. Dr. Odoms-Young's research explores the social and structural determinants of dietary behaviors and related health outcomes in low-income populations and Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Her work also centers on developing culturally responsive programs and policies that promote health equity, food justice, and community resilience. She has served on numerous advisory committees and boards, including the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, Food and Nutrition Board, and committees to develop the nutrition standards for the National School Lunch Program, School Breakfast Program, and to revise food packages provided in the Supplemental Program for Women, Infants, and Children. She has also been the recipient of awards including the Mary C. Egan and Excellence in Dietary Guidance Award from the American Public Health Association Food and Nutrition Section, and the Excalibur Award for Teaching Excellence in the College of Applied Health Sciences, University of Illinois at Chicago. And with that, I will welcome Dr. Odoms-Young up to the stage.
Thank you so much, and also thank you for the invitation. I'm humbled, particularly from my colleagues Carol and Jen, for recommending me for this, because I'm new to Extension, even though I've been at many land grants, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I was at Penn State for a period of time as a postdoc, and I was at Cornell as a graduate student. And so the first thing I want to do before I get started is really just give honor to God for being here and in this new position, and my ancestors from Mississippi and Arkansas, because it really is on their shoulders that I stand here today. And I'm the first, I think I'm only the third director of the FNEC, and I'm surely the first Black director. So I'm learning a lot, and actually after the wonderful DEI panel, hopefully the welcome wagon, I've gotten a really positive reception at Cornell, and I'm hoping that the welcome wagon continues. So I'm going to talk about trans challenges and opportunities for urban extension, building on the past, seizing the present, and really maximizing the future. A lot of my work is in communities. I've worked in communities for 20 plus years. I always have been a part of a variety of communities, a variety of social identities, and so I want to talk about that and how we can work collaboratively and think collaboratively. And so although I'm the speaker, I don't want to be a talking head. The idea is to build and for us to have a collaborative session as we think through the future challenges in our field. The first thing I want to start out by doing, the first thing that I would like to start out with is a land acknowledgement, because Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, the Cayuga Nation, and the Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations. I think this is really important because I think that was discussed in the DEI panel, that in New York State, the way that Cornell came to be is through a painful history and dispossession of land. And so we have to be clear about that. It's important that we understand our history and the place that we occupy. And that's important. It's not about guilt. It's not about, this is history, this is fact. And so I think it's important to understand the past. And even though we weren't there personally, it is important for us to understand the context in which we sit when we go in communities or when we are in community. So by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to describe the history of cooperative extension. You don't need me to tell you about cooperative extension. You can all probably already do that. I'm going to talk about applying a SANKOFA lens and what that means. To really explain the trends and challenges facing cities right now, the whole field of resilient cities and where we fit within that, and then discuss approaches and strategies for making urban areas more resilient. And then next steps. So we've all been in COVID. The issues have emerged around just how our food system is not as stable, supply chain, food insecurity. We've been talking about these issues for over 2 years. But the COVID-19 pandemic was also the backdrop for the murder of George Floyd. And if you look at a lot of universities, this was really revolutionary in thinking. People came out with statements, and it really raised awareness about centering equity, justice, and also having an anti-racist praxis. We were not talking about, honestly, an anti-racist praxis in mass nationally until this case, although there's been hundreds of cases. Despite the history, this was a catalyst to think about DEI or EDI, or what some people say JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so this was acknowledged in the field of public health actually in 2001, where racism was deemed a public health issue. And it reminds us about the role that structural factors play, even though we may be doing individual level work, that structural factors are important. So I want to talk about using a SANKOFA lens, and some of you may be familiar with the SANKOFA. It comes from the Kan people of Ghana. It really, though, has been broader because people in the African diaspora, it's been embraced as it relates to Pan-Africanism. It's one of the Adinkra symbols that's depicted by this bird flying forward with its head turned backwards. With the idea is that it's not taboo to go back and fetch what you forgot. And so it's important, again, that we use that historical context and understand the historical context as we move to the future. But we got to move to the future. So a lot of times people want to continue to talk about the past, which we need to do. But we also have to think about solutions for how we heal, close those gaps, and engage in reconciliation. And so taking from the past what is good and bringing it into the present in order to make positive progress through benevolent use of knowledge. So how do we draw on the past to inform the future? All of us are here because of this 1862 Smith-Lever Act in 1914, that Cornell Cooperative Extension, which is the largest education system of its kind in the world, delivering research and education-based education through the land grant system. It was, of course, signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln with the theory that education and research developments need to be in community to create societal change. So if we look at the 1862s, we know the history of the 1890s, and then the Morrill Act revision that established 3 institutional categories of land grant, of the land grant system, including 1862s, 1890s, and 1994s. So really this focus, and I want to link this to how we make sure that cities are resilient. How do we translate science into practical solutions, not just solutions? So I'm a researcher by training, honestly. Even though I've worked in communities, I'm very researchy. So when I get at my computer and I'm typing or developing theoretical frameworks, I think somebody said that if the theory is flawed and not inclusive, then we have a problem. So we have to make sure on campus, too, that researchers are understanding what's happening in practice, because we can produce some ivory tower theories that don't work in communities. And so it's important when we talk about translating science that science gives people practical solutions to real world problems. We have to identify emerging research questions. Research questions come from the field. They shouldn't only come from campus. And then prepare people to break down the cycle of poverty, encouraging healthy lifestyles, preparing youth for a responsible adulthood, and responding to disasters. And we've seen in California the fires that happened and pivoting because of that, pivoting based on COVID, and because of what actually, I'll quote my minister, he says the pandemic of racism, what he calls the 1619 pandemic. Starting and of course it didn't start in 1619. We know that it started way before 1619, but connecting people to information and available assistance. So since 1914, where the majority of Americans lived in farming communities, we know that that's not the case. So in 2020, 46 million residents lived in rural areas, making up only 14% of the population. And so a large percentage, so in 2020, 23,000 people, so 10% of the population in a typical urban county in 2020. So 23,000 compared to 245,000. So most people are residing in urban areas, and that's why it's not that rural areas are not important, but it means that we have to think about what are solutions in urban areas as well. So non-metro counties actually lost population during the 2010s to 2020, where the metro populations increased nearly 9%. So we have these shifting demographics. We know 1914, when this program started, when this system started, that there's a lot of differences, right? Right? Yeah. So we see a lot of differences. In 1914, 90% of African Americans lived in the rural communities in the South. Because of what? Slavery, segregation, slavery. So post-slavery, Jim Crow, etc. What was happening in 1830 where you had land dispossession? That is different. We know that that history played a role in what's happening now. And so it's important to think through when this started, where were people? Everybody wasn't in the same place. So we have these shifting demographics also when it comes to urban populations now. When you look at white and black, indigenous communities, Hispanic communities, or Latinx communities, and others. So you see this shifting to urban, and this is happening globally. So there's several issues that are facing urban communities, and this has been of great study. Social segregation and exclusion. Actually, some people predict that the lack of social connectedness is probably one of the main drivers of poor health outcomes right now. And we know that post-COVID, that this has even been exacerbated between both people that are aging and then the youngest populations. Energy and environment, climate change, excessive pollution and low climate mitigation and resilience, government infrastructure, fiscal challenges and budgets, economic development, food access and security, public safety. So we've heard on both sides issues of public safety in communities and also about state-sanctioned violence. So part of this idea of public safety, about who's safe, are we safe in our communities? Housing, affordable housing specifically, public education, transportation, technology and data, and health care. So this is just an example. If you look at food insecurity rates in 2020, it actually increased in cities and suburbs where there was little change in rural areas. And this is from data from Feeding America. And you also see food insecurity rates increase for Black and Latinx individuals. It actually, we were very concerned that food insecurity rates were going to increase nationally, but they actually did not. They only increased among certain groups. In addition to Black and Latinx households, it also increased for families with children. And so people that are single head of households. So even though we thought we were going to have this increase across the board, it was really those most people that already had challenges with food insecurity where you saw that increase happen. So extension can play a key role in urban resilience, the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems within cities to survive, adapt, and grow. no matter the chronic stresses or acute shocks. And COVID is a shock and a stressor. So by strengthening the underlying fabric and deepening its understanding about the risk. So how do we play a key role in both deepening our understanding as well as being a catalyst for change? So there's 4 areas, and I'm going to move around a little bit. There's 4 areas. And what's funny is that these areas are the areas that we focus on. So economy. So research shows that there's 4 areas that drive resilience in cities: the economy, society, governance, and the environment. So these are the 4 key areas. And so it's interesting because when I looked at the National Urban Extension leaders, as far as overlap, there's a key focus. So looking at a substantial presence in cities and metropolitan areas to make them more viable. When we look at demographic trends, partnerships and collaborations to strengthen communities, professional development. When we think about, we're not just a program that's doing serving communities, we're a workforce development program. So we bring jobs to communities that help the economy. And so that's critically important when you look at urban areas. So there's several examples of this. I mean, all I had to do was a Google search and see all of the wonderful work that's happening. University of New Hampshire, and their focus on economic recovery. Cornell Cooperative Extension, I couldn't not talk about Cornell Cooperative Extension since they pay my salary. That Cornell Cooperative Extension and an urban agriculture program. In 4-H, serving communities, BIPOC communities, and communities, all communities, both big and small, within the metropolitan area. In Washington State, I know I heard somebody say they was from Washington State in the last session, looking at action-oriented collaborations. And I spent some time in Detroit and saw the work that was being done around urban agriculture. And in Massachusetts, this idea of 4-H and STEAM. So there's a lot of work that's being done, but I want to talk about future considerations and learning from the past. Do you all know who that is? Who is it? It's Future. And of course, we know that Sierra probably learned from the past on that. Yeah, because probably, yeah, a very different, so what do we need to do? We need to understand history and underlying causes. Racism is not just an interpersonal action, it's in policy, in practice. Let's be clear about that. We can personally change, which we should do. Look at implicit bias, understand our actions, but also policies have to change. Because we have racism. Racism is a system. It's not just an action. It is a system layered on top of other systems. We have to acknowledge and avoid more structural and cultural violence, because we have been the source, and I say we have been the source. I know from a nutritional standpoint, even as a person of color, I've gone in communities and engaged in what could be considered cultural violence by telling people essentially that their practices don't have a base in evidence. It may not be our evidence. It may not have come from the lab, but it comes from a way of knowing that people in communities, that's cultural violence. To avoid a reductionist approach, consider intersectionality, and we have to go deep. Assets versus deficits, taking a life course approach, moving upstream, and then focus on building ladders, but also bending trees. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then building diversity in the field, and personal resilience among staff. Because really our greatest asset is staff. And so we want to make sure that we support staff. So this is really striking because racism has had a profound impact on our society. People of all races, because it is a system, not only people of color. Some people feel like it has not allowed our society to develop at the point that it would have developed if we did not, if it was not founded on racism, and that it wasn't in the fabric of our society. Racism affects health, and this is just some examples. Again, I'm nutrition, so the examples are nutrition. So racism affects health, and when we look at race as not a genetic category, but a social category, and the impact that it's had on people, no matter the income. And so this is a quote from David Williams at Harvard. And I think what's striking is he says about 220 African Americans die every day in the United States who would have not died if their death rates were similar to those of white people. 220 a day. Some people have talked about it's like a plane falling out of the air or 3 buses crashing. For most of us, that would not be acceptable. And a lot of this is linked to chronic disease, not to what we think of as homicide. The rates actually are quite lower when you look at the amount of death, the death toll, excess death that's associated with that. This is all linked to history. And I think the timeline becomes really important. So we talk about years of slavery, Jim Crow and segregation, racial inequality. Many of this happened during the time that we're working, that we're also policies within our system are being developed. How do we build on this? Again, it's not about guilt. It's a fact. It's a fact. So part of that is looking at how do we move and understand the fact that people have been under a system where they've been viewed as being inferior for a significant number of years. So how do we intervene when we take this into consideration? And I want to make sure I don't run out of time. I'll go quicker. Good, okay. So understanding the history and the underlying causes. So this was an article in the Atlantic about black farmers and land loss. So black farmers lost almost 800,000 acres of land, which translates into financial loss of more than 3.7 billion in today's dollars. So understanding the history and the underlying causes. If we don't address root causes, the issues will continue to persist. And so income and wealth that's associated with this history of structural racism can expand or restrict how households purchase food. And one thing I want to mention, because my focus of my work is on African Americans are an example. This is an example of how structural oppression works. But structural oppression works in almost every community in the United States in some way. So my work is on African Americans because it is, I hate to say one of the best examples, one of the best, but we know that the best is what? Indigenous communities. They have had the longest history of dealing with structural racism. But if you look at this wealth gap, the wealth of, and this again, this is large, this is national. The wealth of white communities is 10 times the wealth of black communities. It's not just that people became low income. They became low income because of historical oppression and histories. Also, understanding history and underlying causes. We talk a lot about food deserts and food swamps and food apartheid. And this emerged in the public health and health literature and really around the late 1990s, early 2000s. But this is linked to housing discrimination. We have to understand how this came about and how segregation played a role. But I think what's really important is the fact that even the literature is not new. This was discussed in the 1960s. It was also in the Kerner report. So the idea that it just comes around, this has persisted. It's not new. We haven't addressed it. There was even in 1968, and I was born in 1968 actually, a U.S. Congressional House committee was convened, and they had a session on consumer problems of the poor, supermarket operations in low-income areas and the federal response. That was in 1968. So some of these issues have continued to persist. So we need to understand the history. It also helps us with thinking about lessons learned about how we address these issues. Okay, I'm going to move quicker. So to acknowledge and avoid more structural and cultural violence, recognition is required for reconciliation. We cannot push it under the rug. Colonization disrupted people's traditional food systems and life. Land dispossession, also you may be familiar with the Indian boarding school, the whole system where that disrupted families. So structurally violent policies, again, it's not people, it's people that may enact it, but it's structurally violent. These are policies. And acknowledge that people have had years of trauma. And so think chances, not only choices. A lot of times we focus on the individual level. And again, we have to acknowledge this idea of, and even this came from the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities in a written statement, that unquestionably the history of land-grant universities intersects with that of Native Americans and the taking of their lands. So we have to avoid a reductionist approach. People are living in complex systems, but unfortunately, and this is a U.S. issue, whether it be NIH, whether it be USDA, whether it be CDC, is we work in silos. We work in nutrition or we work in youth development. We have this idea of like, there's people that's working in violence. Oh, I only work on violence. I only work on housing. I only work on this. But people are showing up as whole people, whole families. They're not just food. They're not just violence. They're not housing. All of these things are working together. And so when people have insecurity, they have uncertainty and anxiety about oneself and lack of confidence. It doesn't matter whether it's food security, insecurity, or housing insecurity. So if we can avoid a reductionist approach, how do we work collaboratively to think about holistic perspectives? So number 4 is really considering intersectionality, and that was mentioned before. We have finally had a understanding about race, but race intersects with many other identities that lack privilege as compared to other identities. So that includes race and structural racism, but also class. Class is so important when it comes to U.S. society. Ethnicity and ethnocentrism, colorism, which we rarely talk about, sex and gender patriarchy, sexual orientation, and heteronormativity. And this is one, we have a project around in WIC as it relates to gender inclusive language, gender neutral language, which we had this sort of constant conversation. What happens when, are our interventions responsive to gender identity and sexual orientation? So issues around, of course, sexual orientation, I think when you mentioned about diversity has to have a lot. Sexual orientation, so the diversity of orientations that we embrace when we think about, or identities. Do we have interventions? And I know in nutrition, we've been working on this. How do you serve a community that's transgender? How do you look at other families, not just the idea of this traditional family? People are showing up with all kind of family combinations, not just one type of family. And let's not to mention extended family. So part of this idea, oh Lord. So disability and ableism and other forms of systemic oppression. So do we have interventions that are responsive to LGBTQ plus populations? How is that showing up in our work? So this is really important when you look at risk. Again, as I mentioned there, food examples, I look at food insecurity. Sexual minority women are more, so black sexual minority women are more than 200 times as likely to report food insecurity. So even within racial groups, when you intersect that with sexual orientation or sexual minority status, you see a huge bump in risk. So number 5, because I know I got 10 of these. So we got to go deep, not surface.
we like surface. And again, I won't talk about anybody else. I can only talk about the nutrition folks because I am nutrition. And so I'm talking about myself. But I know this shows up in a lot of curriculum. Surface structure, yeah, we want to have the language. We want to have the music. We want to have the attire when we look at our materials. But are we going deep? Because deep is beliefs, it's values. So this is what, when we talk about culture, and a lot of times people conflate what comes out of structural oppression and culture. It's like, no, that's structural oppression. I don't show up. We've looked at people talking about flaming hots. I don't know how many people come to me and say, flaming hots is a part of black community. I don't remember flaming hots. Flaming hots are not a part, flaming hots are not cultural. So when people show up and tell me that's cultural, no, that's not cultural. Flaming hots is not, it comes from ethnic marketing. It comes from a history. So I don't remember any kind of Cheeto being a part of culture. It's not linked to any beliefs. It's not linked to any values. Your epistemology, your ways of knowing. No, it comes from marketing. So part of this idea of talking about things are cultural. They're not cultural. And so we need to look deep. So what are those cultural values, beliefs, the norms, the worldviews of a targeted cultural group? And another thing, and I might get put out, but a lot of times we only talk about culture for people of color. We need to acknowledge that there is culture. There's geographic culture. There's culture within community. And so it's important that we acknowledge that culture and understand, is a culture focused on collectivism or individualism? What is that belief and norm, and how did it come about? So assets versus deficits, and this is so important. Many times we focus on deficits. And this is more theoretical, like we talk about needs. We talk in the language of needs. And so the idea, how do we talk in the language of assets? So focus on effectiveness. People not as consumers or just passive recipients of education. When I was in graduate school in the 80s especially, the models were like, we're going to teach people something. And they're going to sit and listen to us. And then maybe we'll engage them in some conversation. But they were not producers of knowledge. So the idea that there's something about producers, people are producers, and this comes out of asset-based community development, where people are not just a collection of deficits. Residents can lead, they can co-lead, and then also be part of that power. They're not just there to observe. And part of this was written in the Chicago Beyond document about looking at wisdom. Could we really be missing out? Maybe we haven't found all of the solutions because we're missing out. Could we be missing out on community wisdom because of conversations about research are happening without community being meaningfully present? When we develop these curricula, are community meaningfully present? Can we effectively partner to get the full truth? And I remember I'm an ethnographer by training. I would go in people's homes and they would tell me something. And then as I stayed around a while, maybe at month 5 or 6, they start telling me the real story. I start seeing, I'm like, wait a minute. 3 months ago, well, Dr. Odoms, I didn't really know you. So I just told you whatever, the surface thing. So now you see the real thing. And I remember actually so much the real thing, somebody showed me their delivery video. And I was like, that might be more the real thing than I want. But, so part of this idea, do we give people ownership? Are they owning? Not just, consumers. So making sure people own and that we understand what value is generated for whom and what costs, and that we're also accountable. And then it's critical that we take a life course perspective. We have to start in infancy. All of the literature shows early life. So how do we address early life? This is an example from breastfeeding and breastfeeding disparities. So 8, and I'm almost done. Moving upstream, again, policy systems and environmental change. These are policies that need to be changed. How do we make sure that we move upstream? We know upstream drives downstream. And so there's many policies that are important that can be part of our practice. And then number 9, and again, I'm almost done. A lot of times we have moved past equality, thank goodness. We've moved past the idea of one size fits all. 2, that we need tools and ladders, that we need to think about equity. But when are we going to not only build ladders, but bend trees? It's important that we bend trees because justice means bending trees. We can build ladders, which are helpful, but systems change is really building trees. The person shouldn't still need a taller ladder, as sometimes the tree should be bent. Okay. So lastly, building diversity in the field and personal resilience among staff and community. This was a study that was done by my colleague Jill White about Black dietitians and nutritionists, thinking about what are some of those barriers. And I know things were talked about. It scares me a little bit that as I travel across, somebody said, my personal safety, that my ears perked up. I'm like, wait a minute. So you mean I took this job and I might go to some of these counties and my personal safety will be threatened? Nobody told me that. Eduardo. Where's Chris Watkins? I saw him. Chris. That I was like, personal safety, wait a minute. I didn't sign up for that. I'm like, so, but I'm just joking. But the idea of this idea that we need to build a diverse field, and I'm not only talking about racial diversity. And we did a WIC study, and we were curious, how many people that a WIC staff identify as LGBTQ? It wasn't a question that had been asked before. We may come up with a variety of identities, and we can't bring those identities to work, but those identities are an asset to serving populations. So that's the question. How do we look at building a diverse field? And that means that we need to support staff to be resilient. Do people feel like they have purpose? Are they confident? Are we supporting them as people? Adaptability, how flexible are we? And we know we saw this during COVID. Not only people in communities were struggling, staff were struggling. 2, because of it was a pandemic. We all had challenges. So this is me on the right. That's actually when I got to Cornell, when I had hair still, and I was 20-something years old. 22 years old. That was when I started graduate school, 22 years old. And I was like, man, I know everything. Well, of course, the person on the left knows nothing. Even PhD, 2 postdocs later. Because the reason why is because we have not solved the issue. So how do we work together to solve this issue? And I think it's important when we look at Fannie Lou Hamer, the idea, if you give a hungry man food, he will eat. But if you give him land, he will grow his own food. So the question is, how are we giving people land? Maybe not exactly, but the idea that we need to give people the ability, they should be able to go off and honestly not come back. So part of it, or, come back, but in a collaborative way. The idea to continue to build and teach, and we continue to learn and work together, and lessons learned and evolve. And so I'm going to end there. Thank you. Oh, it's still great. Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joanna from the University of Minnesota. Thank you for everything that you presented to us. My question is, especially around resilience. And so I'm in youth development. We work to build resilient youth who are learners and leaders. And you talked about resilience in the context of systems that are oppressive and racist and all the isms. I think my question is, and take it as you will, how do we not let systems off the hook as we work with communities, knowing that we're not in the policy world, things like that? So how can we not let systems off the hook?
I think in a few ways. One is we always think about big P policy, not little p policy. So we have organizational policies that we can work towards revising and also work with others, our partners, in thinking about how do policies impact, and sometimes policies can be against our work. We're doing X, and then because of these oppressive systems. So the first thing is to look at your own system, look at your system and say, where can I leverage or change? Because the small p policy that we engage with every day, those are really important policies that may affect how people engage in their practice or what they do, what curricula is used, how do we approach our work. So I think part of these huge systems are really important, but if we look at even our scope of influence, we have policies or procedures in place that could be modified to buffer that impact of structural oppression on people. And so doing an organizational assessment, looking at where, one example, we disaggregate data. Some systems don't disaggregate data. They don't understand where some things may be playing out. Are certain types of curriculum approaches, does it have the same effectiveness or outcomes for people? And are those outcomes long term? So some of it is just starting with, internal. How do we buffer those systems if we're not focused on policy? I think, and somebody mentioned this, through trauma-informed approach. One is understanding history. And so if we understand that people are facing trauma and we show up, and again, don't put me out, nutritionists, we're just talking to them about the dietary guidelines, that's not going to work. If I just, if I had to just take two, it really will make it not effective. So the part is like increasing our effectiveness. How do we leverage maybe conversations about the dietary guidelines to help with the trauma that you're experiencing? Because racism is traumatic. It is, and structural oppression is traumatic. And so people are experiencing that. Being low income is traumatic. So part of the idea that we want people to learn, definitely. We want them to prepare better meals. We want them, you're talking about youth development. We want youth to go on and really be able to be have leadership and be whole. But the idea is that we want them to be whole. And in some ways, part of the engagement may need to go beyond youth to families. And so I know a lot of people do engage families, but it's hard if you're only engaging. I know, again, I can only use nutrition examples. We worked in schools in SNAP Ed. It's like, okay, well, this is a 10-year-old child. We need to see how do we engage the parents, because the parent is also experiencing racism. It's the classic Bronfenbrenner idea that people are in layers. And so, but I'll be curious, how do you think? Because I'm not from Minnesota. So in Minnesota, with the youth that you work with, are they experiencing racism? And then what do they tell you?
Me?
Yeah. So have you said, how are they, when you ask, how are you being impacted by racism? How does racism impact your development as a person?
I think the one that sticks with me is what was mentioned in the panel is I can't show up as myself. If I'm doing well, one young person says I got a straight A or straight A's on something, and the teacher asked if I cheated, rather than saying, so those micro and major. So a lot of my work is on their pathways, for higher ed, but really for futures that they value, where they can thrive. And so that's where sometimes I struggle with, and I'm still learning, I should say, around resilience, to navigate and understand the structures. But sometimes it just bums me out that that's always the pathway, is navigating a teacher that'll accuse you of cheating rather than saying good job and getting an A.
Can 4-H invite teachers to a workshop?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so
And administrators and government officials, yes.
so I think the first thing, if in a school district, if you're having teachers that are engaging in microaggressions, which, I mean, like, that's not unusual, then the question is that it may not be at the level, again, of the big P, but it's starting to raise awareness. This work is slow, and it can be viewed as dangerous. Honestly, I read the work of Martin Luther King. I'm like, could be dangerous. When you look at the triple threat, these things are talked about, but it's slow. So it can be baby steps. So I would say you hit it right on. If the teacher is the source of the microaggression, then the intervention also, in addition to youth, needs to be with teachers. Maybe teachers not only about how do you have an inclusive classroom? There's so much work in education, honestly, from the National Equity Project around education with teachers. And so part of that idea is, how do we move up? Because we can focus on youth, but we can move up within systems.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. And I would have warned you. So just know that. So I am, I love the presentation. I love the pieces, and the piece that I'm really leaning into and would love to have more conversations about, and that's where my question is. So I'll hold that for the second piece. There's something about the piece on resilience that, for me, speaks to the ways in which we conduct performance reviews. And when I see resilience and I saw the characteristics of resilience, I wondered, well, why don't we have this in some of our performance reviews? Why aren't we having conversations with our staff around these characteristics of resilience? Because if we're intending to build resilience, then we have to support our staff in building that resilience. And we know that if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't count, right? So that's an observation. And the second piece is, and I think I don't think you already spoke to this a bit, the bending the tree. I love that. And the reason I love it is because it really is about challenging the status quo. It's about not accepting what is or what has been, what Regina shared earlier, the way we've always done things as the way things have to be. So I wonder if you could give some more examples, or perhaps an example of what that might look like. I heard some of it in what you just shared in response to the last question, but I wonder if there's other examples of what that looks like for us within Extension. Thank you.
And that's why I think that the first level, when you talked about the performance assessments, the idea of doing an organizational assessment is critical, because what is not measured is not paid attention to, and then what's not in hiring is not paid attention to. Where, if we don't evaluate competencies around certain areas, that's also not paid attention to. So part of the idea of internally in thinking about how do we layer is bending our own trees. And so that starting of the bending of the trees and then working with partners. So people still view embracing, and again, I like the Jedi because it adds the J to equity, diversity, and inclusion, is culture and climate. And culture and climate is critically important. Don't get me wrong. It's critically important. But if you look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that is, 1964, that is the push, because in some ways we have to have policies, and we have to have not only policies that deal with hiring, or policies that deal with like big policies. We also have to put things in practice. So are we asking about competencies? When you hire somebody, do you know if they're racist? Should we be surprised? We didn't ask it in the interview. That all of a sudden we have people that have certain beliefs. Now, again, some things are against the law. Don't get me wrong. I'm not advocating for things that are against the law. But the thing is that in our policies, if we're creating a culture, then the question is, and also not only when people come in, supporting people while they're there. That's the thing, supporting people while they're there. I come with my own beliefs that I've had to change. I've had to change some beliefs because maybe I had a perspective and it was through research and knowledge and understanding what was effective that I had to bend a bit. I couldn't just be, they call me Angie Odoms when I grow up. They couldn't just still be Angie Odoms. I had to be different because I learned something. And so it's important that we give people and we support people as they learn. So I think part of it is, how do we bend trees? We bend our own trees first. And the other thing is that we do have to change policies to engage in bending tree work. And that takes advocacy. Traditionally, a lot of this has been focused on individuals or families. And so now, and as a matter of fact, when Tom Vilsack gave the address about nutrition security, a lot of it was kind of leaning towards bending trees. So the question is, at least in some ways, but I know there's been some pushback on that. So how do we think about advocating for bending tree policy, not only practice, teaching, because research has moved towards policy systems and environmental change. And so since we know that that's effective, we need to figure out how to advocate for some of our programs to be able to bend more trees. We are bending some trees, but to bend more trees and deal with root causes.
Hi. Sorry. Let's thank Dr. Odoms-Young for yeah. Okay, I just have a couple of announcements before you leave for lunch about the community site visit tours. For the people going on the tour in Trenton, at 12:30, you need to meet your tour hosts in the lobby outside so that we can walk you to your bus. This gives you approximately 20 minutes to get your things together, to charge your phone, use the restrooms, grab your box lunch from the gourmet dining hall, and then to be here so that you can the bus is going to leave at 12:45, so you need to be at the lobby at 12:30. Don't be late because buses can't wait. All other tours will have a chance to eat lunch before we leave. Please remember, everyone, to charge your phones if you need to during the lunch. For people going on the Independence Hall tour or the Ben Franklin Bridge walking tour, at 1:15 you will need to meet your tour hosts here in the multipurpose room. For all other tours, we meet outside the main entrance of this building at 1:15 to walk you to the buses. Be sure to be on time. We look forward to enjoying Camden, Philadelphia, and Trenton with you. There are some spots still open for certain tours. If you would like to sign up, head to the registration desk in the lobby. I'm giving the Urban Ag tour, so if there are some people, yesterday, the Urban Ag tour in Camden, so if there were some folks that got closed out of that tour, if you're interested, you can go and sign up for that at the lobby. And that's all I have for announcements. Are we all good? Excellent. Thank you.